Hello. If you found your way to this video or if YouTube somehow directed you here, there's probably a good chance that you've been watching a lot of videos lately on the topic of teachers quitting the profession. That might mean that you've been watching some thoughtful pro and con videos about whether it makes sense to change careers. Or it might mean you've been watching a whole bunch of the viral videos where teachers tell you why they're leaving the classroom for good. Either way, that may mean you're considering quitting your own teaching job. And if that's where you're at mentally, this video is for you. I'm Roxana Eldon. I'm an author and course creator, and I've been working with teachers for about 20 years. And I want to be clear. I do believe there are some valid reasons to quit teaching, and I don't believe the profession is for everyone. But I also believe that too many teachers quit too soon and for the wrong reasons. The purpose of this video is to make sure that that is not what's going on with you. I want to promise up front that this is not a guilt trip video about how much the kids need you to stay in the classroom. I'm assuming you don't need a pep talk like that. I'm assuming you're a dedicated teacher and you're craving practical, emotionally honest advice so that you can make the best decision possible. Today, I'm going to share the 5 things I recommend you do before making the decision to leave the classroom. Number 1 is something pretty basic that we just have to get out of the way, which is to make sure that you are not on a huge sleep deficit right now. Every now and then someone asks me, what is the one piece of advice you would give to any teacher? And this is it. Not sleeping enough is the quickest way to become a worse version of yourself. When you haven't slept enough, you become forgetful, you become impatient, you get worse at making decisions, worse at critical thinking, and you are more likely to overreact. Does that list sound like the type of teacher you are trying to be? That is just a summary of the huge amount of sleep-related research that is out there. Plus, you kind of know this from experience. Personally, when I look back at my most regrettable moments in the classroom, they almost all happened when I got way less sleep than I should have the night before. The good news is that this is one area of your professional life where you can make change almost immediately. You probably can't turn your classroom management around in one day, but you might be able to take a nap at the end of this video, and you can definitely aim for a good night of sleep tonight. This also means that if you're in a time of life when you're not able to get as much sleep as you know you should, you want to factor that into a major life decision like changing careers. Recommendation number 2 is to start thinking of teaching as a job. More specifically, start thinking of teaching as a job you can get better at rather than a calling that you're not feeling passionately enough about. A lot of advice in teaching is framed as you're doing the most important work in the world, failure is not an option. But sometimes you want to say, this is all the time and energy I have. Can someone please tell me what I should really spend it on? And no one will tell you because they don't want to say, maybe you should spend less time on this other thing that people also told you was extremely important. When we talk about the career as a calling that comes directly from your soul or a mission where failure is not an option, that makes it really hard to talk about the kind of trade-offs we would talk about if we were just talking about this as a job you want to do well, which of course it is, because it's important. Teachers' time, effort, and emotional bandwidth are some of the most finite resources in education. My courses, which are collectively called the Maintain and Stay Sane program for teachers, are meant to help educators make real decisions about how they want to spend those resources. The courses are not just for people who are thinking of leaving the classroom. But if you're in a state of mind right now where you're considering bailing on teaching entirely, there may be some improvements you can make in your life that you might have otherwise thought of as selfish, but are actually more like turning down the treadmill so that you can keep up. And by the way, this is not the same as quiet quitting. My understanding of quiet quitting is that it means purposely doing the bare minimum you have to do not to get fired and kind of mentally disengaging from a job. That does not seem like an enjoyable or rewarding way to teach. This is about getting your teaching into what's known as the optimal zone of challenge, which is our 3rd recommendation. Optimal zone of challenge refers to the ideal level of difficulty in a task or situation. It is that sweet spot between being a bored person on autopilot and being someone who constantly feels like you're drowning. And no one knows better than you which direction that dial needs to be turned. If you are in a constant state of overwhelm, you want to turn that dial toward making your life easier. But on the other hand, stagnation feels terrible. It does not feel good to feel like you're doing the same thing in the same way every day. And I know people love to say, no 2 days in teaching are the same, but they kind of are sometimes. I taught Romeo and Juliet 36 times to high school freshmen. And by the end of those 36 times, I knew exactly where in the recorded version of the play I could hear saliva coming out of the voice actors' mouths. Feeling like teaching is boring and tedious can also lead to burnout. So you want to pay attention to that dial of how challenged you feel and adjust it as needed. The fourth recommendation is to pay attention to availability bias and to use it to your advantage rather than your disadvantage. Availability bias, which is also sometimes called the availability heuristic, is a mental shortcut that is built into the way we think. When we are evaluating a situation, we tend to rely on information that pops into our head easily. And a lot of times that depends on stories we've been exposed to recently. If you hear someone describe a terrible car accident right before you get behind the wheel, you're going to be very edgy while driving because you're going to feel like everyone on the road is about to crash into you. The reason this applies so much to your teaching is because of what I like to call the teaching sucks genre of entertainment. It's not a coincidence that people like to watch these videos where teachers share their reasons for quitting. It can feel pretty therapeutic when someone finally tells the truth about how much teaching sucks. And that's especially true if you feel like you've been getting advice that's artificially positive and that dismisses your real concerns and frustrations. But we live in a world of algorithms, which means that anything that's been holding your attention lately, you're going to see a whole lot more of. And if you have watched, a full evening of teachers explaining why they left the profession, you have a lot of those stories readily available to your mind when you step into your own classroom the next day. Suddenly, that student who has their head down in the back of your classroom becomes this portal to this entire universe of frustrations about how kids are disrespectful and they don't care anymore and they just rather sit there with their head down than listen to you, and why are you expected to? The reason that I share this availability bias thing is because this is something I definitely did to myself without realizing it. There was this really funny education blogger that I used to read during my lunch period at school, especially when I was having a frustrating day. This guy was hilarious and he made a lot of good points, but there was also kind of a bitter tone to the humor of the blog. And there was one particular day when my after lunch class came in, and I just remember kind of gazing out at their faces and looking at them one by one and thinking, I don't like you. I don't like you. I don't like you. You, sir, not a fan. You, madam, ugh. It had to do with something that I had read in the blog, and at the time it seemed kind of humorous. Like, no one knows what I'm thinking, so I might as well entertain myself. And to be fair, this was one of my more challenging classes that year. But suddenly it became so hard for me to teach them anything. It was like the burden of teaching this already challenging class suddenly became physically heavier. Only years later, after I became more of a brain science nerd and had read multiple books on how our brains operate, did I realize that there's actually a scientific basis to why that day suddenly felt so much worse. Now, I don't want to overstate this or oversell the science behind this, but your interpretation of what's in front of you will have some effect on the chemicals in your brain that control your mood. So bringing it back to that kid with their head down on the desk. And by the way, I consider teaching a kid with their head on the desk to be an extremely frustrating phenomenon. So I am with you here. And there's no reason not to respond in a way that's in line with your classroom rules. But you can still choose internally how you interpret the student's action, and that's going to have an effect on whether this interaction tightens your emotional rubber band to the snapping point or ruins your day. So maybe you're able to tell yourself, even though I'm going to enforce my classroom rules about not putting your head down, this student probably had a hard night. Or if this is a student who does this chronically and it works your nerves chronically, which is understandable, maybe you're able to say, listen, in 10 years, this student may look back on himself or herself in high school and not be that proud of how they acted the entire time they were in high school, which, by the way, many of us can relate to that feeling. So how do you use availability bias to do this better? Look for sources of information that offer a more generous take on humanity. It is very easy to go online and find the worst possible examples of human behavior, but it is possible to seek out things that give you a little bit of a more generous attitude toward humanity. And I really don't know what the YouTube algorithm or the algorithms of all of your social media accounts may be showing you right now, but keep in mind, this is likely to be a factor in how much you enjoy teaching, and it could be a factor in your decision about whether or not the profession is right for you. The final recommendation before you decide whether or not to end your teaching career is to make all of the lists that people suggest you make before you make a big life decision. That may mean a pros and cons list where you consider your students, your future career possibilities, your finances, what you'd like in a future job, or do or don't want in a job in general. I have a more complete list of all the questions I recommend you answer before you make a final decision about this, and you'll find a link to that in the description below this video and in the pinned comment. But the main thing right now is just to start writing. Get all of your concerns down on paper. Anything you think you should make a list about, make that list. All right, so now you have a lot of lists. What do you do with all those lists? Put them somewhere safe and go get some sleep before you look at them again. I do realize that I'm circling back to the first advice in this video, but in some cases, that is going to be the most important. I cannot tell you if teaching is the right career for you, but I can tell you that you should get some sleep before you make any big decisions at all. Try it. See how things look in the morning.